Well, good morning everyone, and welcome to our lecture this morning. My name is Rob Muscat. I'm the President of the Military History Society of New South Wales. We welcome our members and our non-members. If you are a non-member and you are wanting more information, we do have a card there that you can take away or visit our website, which can be freely accessible. So this morning, our topic is the Gallipoli legend, a reappraisal. And we have Dr. David Martin with us. He's also a member of the Society and a well-known historian. And some of the questions that David will be investigating would be, how did the legend originate? Who was responsible? And is it historically valid? So I welcome David. And there'll be some questions at the end, so I do ask you to hold off until the end. And then again, if people would like to speak to David at the conclusion, I'm sure he'll give up his time to have those conversations. So let's welcome David this morning.
Is this?
Yeah, that's on now.
Okay. So it's about 100 years since the Gallipoli legend took place. So the reappraisal is going back over what's happened 100 years ago and seeing how, in recent years, kind of new ideas have come out. I suppose the first thing is we should look at the word legend. So a legend is a story which, whether it has any factual basis or not, is believed by a significant number of people. The crucial factor is not that it is factual, but that it is believed. Now, there are a few more legends that are better believed than the Anzac legend, but what I'm talking about is just the first chapter of the Anzac legend when it began at Gallipoli. And I'm talking about the first day from about 4:30 in the morning until about 8 o'clock at night time. The reappraisal is what's happened, particularly in recent times, to see how valid it was. I think in the end, the conclusion to come to is that there are two parallel universes. And one is the popular belief as to what happened at Gallipoli and the landing, and that's extremely powerful, and that kind of predominates. The second is what historians think, perhaps recently, what happened, and that is quite different. And they don't have to be resolved. On the 25th of April, you've got Anzac Day, and it's extremely powerful. And you're not going to convert people from believing what they think happened. I would suggest that what they believe was largely determined by the newspapers at the time and a few journalists, and that really took hold of recent times with the Anzac commemorations. It's come under the spotlight, and what historians have come up with is very different from the popular belief. Right, okay, so to start off with the definition, so what we're dealing with is the Anzac legend, but I'm just looking at the first part of it. But over 100 years, I would suggest that this is kind of the basis of the Anzac legend, that the Aussie digger was usually an amateur. I don't think there can be much debate about that because we don't have a large regular army. And the people we're dealing with at the time of the First World War were nearly all volunteers. There were just a handful of officers, typically British officers at Duntroon or wherever, but most of the officers and the men simply came from Australian society. And they'd been training kind of like on Thursday evening or at Easter time in camps to fulfil legal commitments. They weren't really regular officers. So the topic that I'm dealing with certainly deals with amateurs. They weren't highly trained military professionals, and even their high-ranking officers typically weren't. Over time, the word exceptional has come up frequently by historians of recent times. So the Aussie digger was exceptional, at the very least as good as, but typically superior to the soldiers of other nations. Most Australians believe that, and they're not going to be diverted from it. History might kind of suggest a little bit differently. So I'm dealing with the first version of the Anzac legend, which is what Charles Bean wrote in his book published in 1921, 100 years ago. So that's kind of an appropriate thing to give a lecture on. And he asserted, as in distinct from having evidence for, asserted that the origins of the legend back then were to be found in the bush background of the original Anzacs who fought on Gallipoli. Now, you can pick holes in that one, but anyway, so the first Anzac legend is all those things, but especially grounded in most of the troops. He's implying the troops were conditioned largely by what happened working in the Australian outback. So rather than talk in general terms, this is what is generally believed happened at Gallipoli from 4:30 in the morning onwards. So Australians are generally of the understanding that the landing made by the Anzacs on Gallipoli on the 25th of April 1915 proved Aussie exceptionalism beyond doubt, and you won't divert them from that. And heroic embarkation, so this is what I'm suggesting they believe happened. And heroic disembarkation and a murderous machine gun fire, then the scaling, again under heavy fire, of near vertical ridges. Now that should be fairly familiar to you, those ideas. That's where it occurred. But I'll just emphasise that it's a little bit more that what happened on the 25th than the landing at Anzac. You've also got down the south there at Cape Helles, you've got British landing at all those ridges. And then the French is a diversion, they were landing at Kumkal. It was a big operation. That should be familiar to you. There's Anzac Cove. And in front of you, the area that they're going to be rising these vertical cliffs. And that's where they're going to go, straight to the top. The story started at 4:30 when they hit the beach. And by 5 o'clock came around in the morning. Oh, by the way, this is in pitch dark. There's no moonlight. The sun doesn't rise till 6:30. And this is in near dark. They get to the top there at 5 o'clock. I'm looking at it from the point of view of not really original research, but simply looking at what people have said about this. Now, there's going to be fundamentally different explanations coming from these people. I would suggest I'll be emphasising two differences, but there are many more than that. This is not me saying it, it's these people saying it, that they do not agree. Now, those that are most responsible for what you understand to be the Anzac legend are those two on your left. But before I go there, which I will, the top right-hand side is a British colonel at the time and ended up as a general, and he was there also at the time. So you've got these two reporters who are going to be talking about it, but you've also got this British general who's going to write the British official history of the Gallipoli campaign. He will have a very different take on what I'll give you. We'll eventually get to what he says. Okay, so the two people we're dealing with are journalists. They're war correspondents. Now, the landing itself started at 4:30 in the morning, I'm saying in the pitch black. When the landing was going ahead, on that boat, the Miwaska, was the Australian official war correspondent, Charles Bean, and he wrote in his diary, of course it means going under shell fire and probably rifle fire, but it also means gaining the confidence of the men and seeing what I could never afterwards see. So he wants to be there. In a way, he's an eyewitness, but remember he lands at 9:30. I'll suggest that most of the decisions have been made well before 9:30. But there's an interesting thing there that I've written. He wants to gain the confidence of the men, which seems a bit strange. Surely he's there to report what happens. Why on earth is he saying he wants to gain the confidence of the men? But it implies also, I would suggest, kind of writing what they want to hear. The one that is really influential with this newspaper report is going to be Ellis Ashmead-Bartlett. He's an Englishman. He didn't go, he stayed safely on board that boat for most of the day. He didn't go ashore until about 9:30 at night time. His will be the first newspaper report that comes out. By the way, there's going to be this delay when newspaper reports come out. There's going to be a 13 day delay before anything substantial comes out in Australia, and also in Britain at the same time. These are the two reporters who are going to be the authors of those reports. But there's this delay. And I also want to emphasise that whilst it's going to take a fortnight at least or whatever for the news in detail to get there, then there's going to be another part of the communication with people reading these reports in Australia, snipping out what they've written, putting it in an envelope and sending it to the troops back there. And there's a month in that. So the whole thing, it's going to be 44 days before the troops at Gallipoli read what they said. But it was about 13 days and another week then before both of those reports appeared in Australia. Okay, this is me talking. The landing began at 4:30 a.m. in pitch darkness. Sunrise wasn't until 5:25 a.m. Even combat-hardened veterans have a limited comprehension at best of what is taking place around them in a battle. With few exceptions, the Anzacs were raw and inexperienced troops in battle for the very first time. There were a handful of exceptions. There were some Boer War veterans, but not too many of them. They would have found it almost impossible to make any sense of the big picture. And it was based upon talking to them that Ashmead-Bartlett and Bean would write their newspapers' reports. Now, it's partly the information that they get from the men, but there's a lot of input into these stories from what Bean and Ashmead-Bartlett are already thinking, believing, want to happen. So I come to the conclusion, for these two war correspondents, there existed considerable scope for creative interpretations. So I'd suggest that it's not just factual. Perhaps you might even suggest it's heading towards propaganda. So this is just to emphasise this delay. Ashmead-Bartlett's newspaper report would be published 13 days after the landing, simultaneously in Britain and Australia. On the 7th, it appeared in Britain. On the 8th of May in Australia, Saturday. Bean's report did not appear until a week later on the 15th of May. I think it's something to do with a censor or a bureaucracy. He didn't get his through, so he didn't get the honour of being the first one to get his views out there. This is a really good historical source, and it's also a terrible historical source. It's a British artist that's produced it. He did it in 1915, and it seems to me pretty clear that he did it simply on the basis of what he read from Ashmead-Bartlett. Now, it's pretty terrible because, this took place at 4:30 in the morning. And if you look at the troops, this is daylight. You can see underneath the troops running up the beach there, you can see their shadows directly beneath them, so the sun is straight above them. So look, this is quite inaccurate. It shouldn't be taken as seriously, but in another sense it should be, because this person has read Ashmead-Bartlett. This is the idea that he's got, this is what public opinion was like. This is when, even when you read it, say in Australia, you might have come up with a pretty close idea, a conclusion to that one in that illustration. I think it corresponds with this part of Ashmead-Bartlett's newspaper report. The Turks entrenched the shore, so they've got trenches on the shoreline, opened a terrible fusillade and rifles and a Maxim and a machine gun. The Australians rose to the occasion, forming a sort of rough line, rushed at the enemy's trenches. It was over in a minute. The Turks in the first trench were either bayoneted or ran away. Here's another artist's impression of what happens next. I would suggest also from reading Ashmead-Bartlett. But again, look, this is in daylight. Look at the amount of artillery fire that's been fired, and you've got shrapnel and goodness knows what else. And you've got a few Aussie slouch hats there. And I'd suggest it corresponds with this from Ashmead-Bartlett. The Australians found themselves facing an almost perpendicular cliff. I think that's reasonable. Somewhere halfway up, the enemy had a second trench, strongly held, from which they poured a terrible fire on the troops below. This race of athletes proceeded to scale the cliffs without responding to the enemy's fire. In less than a quarter of an hour, the Turks were out of the second position, either bayoneted or fleeing. So the whole thing took from 4:30 to 5 o'clock. They've gone from the beach up above, and it sounds as though the Turks are in total disarray and running away. And to give it, to really pump up his audience, he said, "There has been no finer feat in this war than this sudden landing in the dark and storming the heights. these raw colonial troops, so he's writing from the position of a British reporter, in these desperate hours proved worthy to fight side by side with the heroes, the British who fought at Mons, the Aisne, Ypres and Neufchâtel. Not especially famous engagements, but you know, they're comparing the Australians saying, gee, these blokes are as good as the British. And the Australians would have lapped it up. The people who are reading it in Australia would have thought that's just what they wanted to hear. Okay, now Charles Bean, remember his report appears a week later, another Saturday morning reading for people in Australia. He gives this, puts it in this historical context. They all fought fiercely and suffered terribly. It is a feat which is fit to rank beside the Battle of the Heights of Abraham. And there you've got an illustration of it, when British soldiers climbed steep cliffs to capture Quebec from the French. They're giving the people, Australian people, what they want. Very, very heroic. Another illustration, this one, if you look at the bottom right-hand side, it's painted between 1920 and 1922. It was a commissioned painting, this one, and it was commissioned by the Australian government. And it's the largest landscape in the Australian War Memorial. And then when you're going in the first part of that Gallipoli, it will be there. And the last time the guide stopped and were pointing out various things about this to their audience. Now, from the photographs I showed you at the beginning and what you can see there, this is pretty accurate topography of what went on. Although it's a bit hard to see much of the rest of it, not particularly clear. And I think it corresponds with this part of what the war correspondent Charles Bean, the Australian, wrote. And he said in his newspaper report, perhaps there were 500 to 1,000. Grab hold of that, there's a detail, to 1,000 Turkish defenders where they were deployed was, and he wants to make it Australian audience understand what he's talking about, like a section of the Blue Mountains, full of winding gullies, the feat which will go down in history, again giving this historical thing, when 3 Australian brigades stormed in the face of heavy fire, tier after tier of cliffs and mountains. Now, he says, look at this, he says, when later on, so that was what he wrote as a war correspondent, then later on as official war historian, which he just moved straight into after the war, that position. He said, this represents the glory of Anzac. Well, I don't know about you, but it doesn't particularly strike me as a particularly glorious painting. It doesn't really stir you. So anyway, as the official war historian, he tapped George Lambert on the shoulder and he asked him to do something with the painting. Now, hopefully that's a bit clear. Here's just a section, you can see the men there, and what he asked him to do was, apparently it would seem, to start with, they weren't quite attired like that. He asked them to paint in the soldiers wearing slouch hats. So I think there are six of them there, and 4 of them are wearing slouch hats, and this equals the glory of Anzac, it would seem. Just want to retreat a little bit and just emphasise this thing about the newspapers. The Australian public sits, you know, the 19th century and the Boer War, and of recent times, they wanted to hear how well their troops were going. They wanted to hear that they were fighting bravely, they weren't going to run away, and they hoped perhaps even more than that. And that's what they wanted, gallant, magnificent achievement. That's exactly what was wanted. That's what Ashmead-Bartlett knew the reading public wanted to hear, and the same with Charles Bean. So he's giving them what they want. So that's, I would suggest, that's the legend. Race of athletes, landing under heavy fire, then scaling an almost perpendicular cliff to overcome hundreds of Turkish troops armed with machine guns, forcing the well-entrenched defenders to flee. There has been no finer feat in this war than the sudden landing. Okay, 13 days later in Australia, on the 8th of May, it appears that Saturday morning in the newspapers. For proud Australians, their proxies, the Anzacs, their representatives, have passed for them the test of nationhood. No one's going to question what they've been told. They're just lapping it up. hearing exactly what they wanted to hear. But I also want to emphasise this, that 44 days later after the landing, on the 8th of June, Ashmead-Bartlett's article was read by Australian troops. And what I want to suggest is that this was news to them too, because what happened on that particular day, the 25th of April, wasn't at all clear in their mind. They were raw troops, there was a lot of confusion, it was in the dark, but even when it wasn't in the dark. So they weren't quite certain what the heck was going on. This newspaper article brought into sharp focus what they had done, and they liked what they read. They were being told what they didn't understand had happened. This is what had happened. For the Anzacs, the hero status being conferred upon them, they assumed with considerable enthusiasm. They really liked what they read. And I'm suggesting that this is a very powerful thing, the Anzac legend, by looking at this set of figures. Across Australia, before anything about Anzac, 6,250 Australia-wide had volunteered to serve in the armed forces. It goes back to also these are amateurs, and they enlist. Into May, reports appear, so they go up a bit, the enlistments, 10,526 in May. Next month, 12,505 in June, then it really rises, 36,000 in July, 25, falls back a bit in August. For the rest of the war enlistments bottomed out, there weren't many. I'm suggesting that this has the explanations largely to do with what they read in the newspapers. That's the only source they have about this, that's what they like. As a footnote, I would add this, but I don't want to go into it too much. Between the two newspaper articles, a report had come out in detail about the sinking of the Lusitania and a number of civilians being drowned. Now, they were proud of what the Australian troops were doing, the Australian public, and now they had anger, something they wanted to get at the enemy for what the enemy had done, Germany, perhaps not Turkey at this stage. Anyway, so you have this big blip in enlistments, then it falls off. Okay, so we've dealt with adults reading newspapers, but on the, I think it's the 18th of May, the New South Wales Minister for Education decides to put all of this in a booklet and send it out to schools. It says for the use of senior pupils, etc., but okay, I would suggest for the teaching of the students. So what are they being taught? They're being taught to newspaper articles. And I'd suggest this, as it's been said that journalism was the first rough draft of history. In the case of the 25th of April landing, newspaper articles became the undisputed, definitive historical account to be taught in Australian classrooms. The words of Ashmead-Bartlett and Bean would make an impression on a generation of Australian children that would endure for the rest of their lives for the next 50 plus years. And there's nobody that's going to contradict this. What they heard is what they wanted, and the children are being taught this, and they're lapping it up. Is this historically valid? Well, I've suggested to you toward the beginning that there's a great dispute as to kind of what went on. I'm going to going down very briefly down a bit of a blind alley. What all these people have in common are they were history professors at Australian universities. I could have pulled out a lot more. Now they have your standard these days history professor at Australian university is not into military history. They have a different take on it. So I just want you aware of a different perspective. Now I picked out one, David Kent. He's an expert, acknowledged expert on the Anzac legend, and he says, I am not a devotee of military history. I have no patience with those who enthuse about strategy and tactics and wax lyrical in battle analysis while forgetting the human cost. That's what they're interested in. They're not interested in what happened over there, or perhaps a little bit, but they want to know about the casualties and how bad it was, and then later on, how many were suffering post-traumatic stress, etc. And it goes further than that. I want to know about the lived experience of ordinary soldiers and citizens. It's getting back to the home front. That's what they're interested in, really, not the military. And just one addition to that, to the left, almost getting towards being pacifist, perhaps they were, There's this group, they call themselves cultural historians, and the leader of them is, or the leading light is Jay Winter. He was, during the centenary, I don't think he's there anymore, in one of the Melbourne universities, Monash University. He was a visiting professor. And the story he took down there is the real Anzac tale. What I've just told you, talked about, is not the real Anzac tale, he says, is the story of people of this nation, people living at home, under times, under unendurable stress. We have to use the language of sadness. And they love stories about suicides and people coming back with mangled physiques and reconstructed faces. And this Melbourne professor down below, she says, we're really indebted to Jay Winter for looking at this way, looking at the First World War. But this is a group of people who are interested in military history. So I draw your attention to these people. These are military historians. I've talked about the British official historian, top right-hand side. Look down the bottom right-hand side. A four-star general, General George S. Patton. They both have something to say about the Anzac legend. Remember I said beforehand there are differences of opinion? Above him we've got a Turkish colonel who's since become a professor, and the one I'm going to be drawing upon a lot is Brigadier Chris Roberts, an Australian. But anyway, let's see what the official British war historian has to say about all this. He was there at the time. He was off Cape Helles, anchored there with the British Commander-in-Chief, Sir Ian Hamilton. He was not directly off Anzac, but he was getting as much information as anybody else. Probably, I'd say, a lot better. The intelligence will be coming through. He's on the Queen Elizabeth. And in correspondence, if you look down the bottom there, during the 20s, he commented, the truth about the Australians has never yet been told. He'd be referring to things like those two newspaper articles. He's saying they weren't truthful. And in its absence, a myth, something you can't believe, has sprung up. And the myth is that the Anzac troops did magnificently against amazing odds. He's suggesting that in his opinion, they didn't do magnificently, and this idea of they were up against a lot of, amazing odds was not the case. Now, he's going to be attacked by this in Australian newspapers. Bean says it's, this is horrendous what he's saying. So that when the British official history of the Gallipoli campaign comes out in 2 volumes, 29 and 32, he's pulled it right back because he's been kind of like attacked a lot. But there is true ideas. Now, what about the Americans? I'm sorry. This is what he wrote in the early sections of the draft sections of the history. The landing at Anzac Cove was relatively easy against comparatively small numbers of Turks, not many Turks. When a well-coordinated attack would scarcely have failed to beat down the Turkish opposition and to carry the line to its objective on the highest point of the range, there was confusion among the Australians. Now, you can have a look here at a photograph. Also, notice the headwear. There aren't too many slouch hats. But this is a photograph of Anzac Day on the 25th of April. It does look suspiciously like what the British official historian was saying. They look like they're just mulling around and not very much is being achieved. Okay, sorry, here is the American version. Okay, but at the time, in 1936 he was given a task and he was involved with officer training for the US Marines. And Anzac and Gallipoli is really of interest to them because Marines are into amphibious warfare. So he conducts for the training officers, he draws up a case study of what it was all about. So you might say of the British that sour grapes, and they wanted to blame the Australians for their own failures. Well, I see this bloke's fairly neutral. What does George S. Patton find out in 1936? 1936 he was a lieutenant colonel. He was tasked with conducting the investigation of the Australian landing at Anzac Cove and the Turkish defence. His conclusion was that the Anzac Corps was an entirely inexperienced unit. Well, we can accept that because they weren't regular troops. And that the landing was, in effect, wholly unopposed. Now, I suppose coming under the umbrella of totally unopposed, wholly unopposed would be, you know, a handful of troops, or right up to 100 troops. That would still fit. But effectively, the shores were undefended, he says. Turkish troops, who had to come from in reserve mainly, succeeded due in part to their careful training and open warfare, whereas the Australians, it was folly in sending partially trained troops, no matter how brave, on an operation of this character. Patton cautioned, undisciplined valour accomplishes little but to ensure losses. So he said the whole thing accomplished very little. Well, here's this Australian village I've been drawing a fair amount upon. In the army, then, well, we'll find out his background in a second. And he writes, Anzac was an inadequately trained, inexperienced and poorly prepared force that was outclassed by a better trained, better led, more experienced but outnumbered Turkish force. Now you've just got three people who are saying almost the exact opposite of what the popular version of Anzac is all about. Now you can judge for yourself, just have a look at that. That's this person's qualifications. He's a patriot, he's not out to run us down. And he gives by way of introduction to his research, he says, after interviewing several veterans of the landing during 1978 to 80, so that's where you get your 35 years he's been thinking about this, undertaking the research for an Army Staff College paper, it became evident that the popular view of the landing, the one that's still around, was largely a myth, and that Charles Bean's official history had flaws. He's gone through that carefully over the 35 years or so before he has this book published by the Australian Army History Unit. And for soldiers, lost my place. Myths cloud perceptions and judgments, and for soldiers they can lead to bad lessons being drawn from them. They also cloud our national perceptions. Okay, so hopefully I've established that there are very different views as to what happened, very different interpretations, totally different interpretations. I want to backtrack a little bit and suggest, I want to see where this original idea of Anzac came about. I think this is fairly self-evident. Bean says the tradition of Anzac landing is probably more influenced by Ashmead-Bartlett's first story than by all the other accounts that have since been written. It was the most flamboyant. It was the first one on the scene. And why was it such? Why was it so heroic, etc.? Well, I think the information that follows tells you why. This bloke, Bartlett, was the son of a British Conservative MP. He was educated at a leading public school, Marlborough College, and he had served in the British Army as a lieutenant during the Boer War. I would suggest that he knew what he wanted to write about the landing, possibly before he even got ashore. He was still watching from offshore on that day. And so you get this really heroic type of description from him. But the person that we're really interested in more than anybody else is Charles Bean. And here he is on one of these commemorative stamps at the time. It was taken in 1917, based upon a photograph from the left in 1917. The person you see on the left there, he's the one, George Lambert, who did the big landscape in the Australian War Memorial. And there he's got this picture of Bean. Now, I'd suggest that it's fairly easy to what he's suggesting with his portrait. You've got heaven shining down upon this bloke, and it looks like it's the hand of God who's writing the story. How could you question this person? Now, to confuse you a bit, look at this. He's born in 79, died in 68, but he spoke with a standard English accent. Now, to confuse you even more, look at the quote down the bottom by Ken Inglis. He was an Australian by accident of birth, English by education. What the heck is this all about? Then, Bean made his own discovery of Australia between 1904 and 1914. And this is the Australian official war correspondent. Okay, a bit of background. He was born in Bathurst in 79. His father was an English headmaster there. He'd been educated at an English public school, Clifton College. In 1891, somebody else took over the school, and he took whole of his family back to England. I don't think he had anything in mind, particularly when he was going back there. He eventually becomes a headmaster of another school. But we're interested in his son Charles, that he had two brothers. 11-year-old Charles, he relocated to England. Then in I should say this, that the father is really pumping him full of British military history. They go to the continent, to Europe during summer holidays. One of the things they do is they walk the old battlefield at, where did Napoleon, where was he? Waterloo, yes, thank you. They walk the battlefield at Waterloo. They go to have a look at Nelson's flagship victory at Portsmouth. Okay. Clifton College is where his father was educated, and his father enrolls his son there. And it had a reputation, a military reputation, which is not kind of really all that high ranking as far as English public schools are concerned, but anyway, this is the reputation of Clifton College. It was preparing students for military careers, and two of its graduates were Field Marshals Haig and Birdwood, so it's pretty successful. Okay, so Charles has been full of, he doesn't know much about Australia, he left there, but it's all this British military history. Then he goes to Oxford, reading classics. He gets interested in the history of ancient Greece, but particularly Homer and Troy. And he gets his ideas as to how to write the official history from reading about Troy and all that. And it's an heroic version of history. And he gets this idea from the Greek of great-hearted men. That's what military conflict is about. Then he's looking for a profession, so he goes to study law, goes to the bar. His father had been a teacher here in Australia before he went to Bathurst, and he taught, amongst other places, at Sydney Grammar School in 1875 to 77. And he thought, through the contacts that he'd made, that'd be useful for his son with his budding career as a barrister. So he returns to Australia on the 7th of December on his father's advice, returned to Australia as a 25-year-old, possibly with a career as a barrister in mind, calculating his father's contacts in Sydney would be useful. And he bombs out. He doesn't, it seems as though he never gets any briefs. He works for a judge for a while. He wrote with his kind of Oxford background, pretty impressive, and he's mixing in the right type of circles. He writes a book which he hoped would get published, Observations of a New Chum or something along those lines. He cuts it up, he couldn't get it published. So 8 articles are taken from it and they're put in the Sydney Morning Herald in mid-1907. I want to emphasise, look, this is well before the war, 7 years before the war. And you can find in these articles the origins of the Anzac legend. So it's not about describing what he sees Australian troops doing. He's got this already in his mind, and it's on the shelf later on, and just takes it down and incorporates it into his history. Now, he gets at it in this way. He's come from England, and it's just kind of like a bit Dickensian, this one. And he sees these cities in England, and then it's happening in Australia as places of vice and goodness knows what else. And he sees the British, who had been in their element back in 1588, defeating the Spanish Armada. Since then, it's been going all downhill. And we've got all this crime, etc., in the cities. But he said there's something saving. It's happening in Australia too, but there's a good thing about Australia, which is the people that are living in the outback. And they are reliving the glory days of the British, and they're rejuvenating the idea. And he said if they were to go to war, boy, would they be good fighters. And you look at the words in some of these articles, and that's the basis of the Anzac legend. It's already in his mind. He wants to say this, to argue this, and then the war comes along, and then there's the official historian later on, and he just applies it to it. So it's a pre-existing idea. Okay, there's a picture of him on Gallipoli. He's with Billy Hughes. He was one of the people he was rubbing shoulders with in Australia in his career early on the Western Front, and then he lived at Linfield and used to come into Victoria Barracks up until 1942, each day working on papers writing the official history. I want to go back to a particular incident, which I think is fairly important also in explaining why he has the particular version he does about the Australian troops. And it happens at Mena Camp, and you can see where Mena Camp is. It's just near the pyramids. And the Australians are there from the 3rd of December to the 3rd of April 1915. Now, Bean is a goody-goody to Boy Scout. In late 1914, the AIS Major General William Bridges, on your right there, was having serious problems with some of his troops in Cairo, especially war veterans, it appears. Bridges put it to Bean, the reputation of being somewhat of a Boy Scout, that he write an article in his capacity as the official war correspondent explaining why a number of Australians were being shipped back home in disgrace. With the dateline Cairo, 29th of December 1914, Bean's article would appear in Australian newspapers from the 22nd of January. And it wasn't always produced exactly as he wrote it. They cut it up and edited it. Anyway, it started off the full version. It is idle to contend that the Australian is at present making quite the impression which Australians hope he will make. Now, he says that there are not a lot who are misbehaving. Possibly 1 or 2% in the Australian ranks are uncontrollable, slovenly and dirty. Read for dirty. They're getting sexually transmitted diseases. They are losing Australia her good name. Now, this newspaper report appeared in Australia just at the time when the Australians had gone overseas, and the Australians are wanting to hear good things about what their troops were achieving over there, and this didn't make people very happy. It wasn't really damning of the Australian troops, but didn't matter. Okay, look what happens. So they read about it in Australia. Then they send copies of it to the troops who were in Egypt at Mena Camp. Oh, sorry, this is just by the by. On the 3rd of February 1915, this particular boat carried 169 medical evacuees back to Australia, and there were 132 VD cases. This was the type of thing that he was getting at about these dirty, some of those who were dirty. Okay. On the 2nd of March 1915, the troops in Egypt were receiving copies of Bean's newspaper article through the mail from family and friends in Australia. Subsequently, when he walked through the AIF camp at Mena on the 4th of March, Bean was subjected to loud, sarcastic and intimidatory comments. About 3 years later, returning to the March 1915 section of his diary, he inserted, "I had heard threats that as soon as we got into the fighting, I should be shot." There was little doubt the March 1915 Mena episode continued to play on Bean's mind. In a diary entry of the 8th of March 1918, referred to the unpopularity which I gained in Mena that made me shrink from the men. Now, this is extraordinary, this part. Stopping him from getting to know the life of the soldiers. So here's this bloke who's doing the big description of what the Anzac is all about, and he's frightened of the soldiers, and he's still writing about it 4 years later. So he doesn't associate with them. He associates only with officers, or hardly ever with the men. Having previously committed to tell the unvarnished truth, following the March 1915 Mena episode, a main purpose of Bean's press reports became to publicise the AIF's positive virtues. And this is before they go off to Gallipoli. This conditions what he's going to write at Gallipoli. What was needed, he said in his diary, was stories to stir Australian pride. In his diary of 5th of April 1915, Bean explained his job as Australia's official war correspondent to be partly propaganda work for the AIF, aimed at building morale at home. The bright side has to be written up in one's press reports. In the diary of the 26th of September 1915, he would write, "The tender Australian public only tolerates flattery." And in a memo to AIF headquarters, Bean made it clear that he was seeking to present scenes that will stir Australian pride, which is what the nation I represent wants to hear. And that's kind of the background to what he writes when he sees about the 25th April. Jumping ahead to 1921, he's got to have this big interpretation of why the Australian troops are so good. And this, he gets this in at the beginning of his book, a couple of parts. So there's more than this, but these are some of them. So this is the Anzac legend, Bean's Anzac legend. Fires, floods, and even the concentration of sheep for shearing, or the long journeys in driving bullocks down the great stock routes across the backcountry, offer many conditions similar to those of a military expedition, like the Gallipoli one. The Australian was half a soldier before the war. You know, he'd been out there riding horses, shooting guns. Indeed, the Australian soldier differed very little from the Australian who at home rides the station boundaries every weekday and sits of a Sunday around the stockyard fence. And the typical Australian was seldom religious, actually got to dispute that. So far as he held a prevailing creed, it was a romantic one inherited from the gold miner and the bushman, of which the chief article was that a man should at all times and at any cost stand by his mate. So he's saying that this is the thing that keeps the AIF together. This was and is the one law which the good Australian must never break. And it comes from the bushman. It is bred in the child and stays with him through life. The strongest bond in the AIF is that between a man and his mate. But I would caution this, yet even back then Australia was one of the most urbanised countries in the world. So he says because the Australian troops are from the country, well look at this. It's been calculated that only approximately 17.3% of their AIF came from the bush. Now he must have become aware of this because then he wrote, well, they didn't have to come from the bush, but they read bush poetry and bush stories, and that's why they were like that. So I would suggest that it's a bit rubbish. Okay, now we're going to find out what happens at the landing. For a successful operation, you needed a 4-to-1 superiority in numbers. The invaders needed 4-to-1 superiority from the people that they're going to attack, and they didn't have it. You can see the 3 landings that they made, and then the Turks are already on land. And you see at the bottom of the information there, both sides have approximately 70 or 80,000 men. So they're on hiding to nothing. They're not going to succeed according to all military kind of common sense. But they're going to be helped. They're going to be helped by the German, whom the Turks have placed in charge of their defences, Lehmann von Sanders. I've got their inflexible, overbearing. On the 24th of March, he was appointed by the Turks to be in charge of the defences. And what he did is, you can see, he withdrew from possible landing sites, all these troops inland. And the withdrawal to those spots, well, some people praised it because it shows you how flexible he is, and he'll be able to then move the troops to the landing positions. But they were already pretty much in those positions according to the previous Turkish defensive arrangements, which he kiboshed. And he just leaves a skeleton force on the coast. Had the original defensive arrangements been in position, the Anzacs would have met a murderous fire right from the beginning. That's what the Turks had wanted to do, but he knew better. The Turkish historian down the bottom said von Sanders completely altered the defensive doctrine and defensive plans for the Gallipoli Peninsula. What were the Turks, what were the Anzacs, what was their objective? What were they supposed to achieve? What was the overall strategy of the whole thing? It was to go 5 kilometres and take that rise, that mountain. Well, it was only 768 metres high. Now, if you took that, you'll be able to cut off the south of the peninsula from Turkish troops reinforcing from the north, and the British down the south would be given leeway to do this. They would go up the coast, they would knock out the forts, the artillery, and then that would enable the British fleet to get through the Narrows and up to whatever. So that's another story. So their objective is to go 5 kilometres inland. And from what you're about to see, they only ever get 900 metres and stop, with hardly any Turks in front of them. And the reason why they stop is much to do with this bloke who comes from Scotland, Colonel Sinclair, Ewan Sinclair McLagan. Now, prior to the landing, there was reconnaissance of what they were expecting to find. And you see there I've got circled Gallipoli. Apparently there were kind of Turkish fortifications or old ones there, and Sinclair McLagan saw them, and he saw them and he thought, oh God, they must have troops there. And so he's in charge of the landing. But he's having nightmares about when he lands, coming from his right, there are going to be Turks attacking him. So he's got the orders are for his troops to go as quickly as they can inland and occupy that position. Whether they could have got there or not is another matter, but that was what the order was. And but he's got this nightmare about them coming from the right, and he's going to really mess up the whole plan. Here are the Australians on the islands, Greek islands, before they get to Gallipoli. They're planning how they're going to land. Typically, my understanding of it is there were these steamboats, British steamboats from their battleships. They were pulling three boatloads of Australians. It doesn't really matter. But the key thing about them is that they had machine guns in the front of them, these steam pinnaces, machine guns. And remember, we were told beforehand in the newspaper reports that when the Australians landed, it was against all these machine guns, and it was kind of really brave to do what they did, and they went ahead regardless. Okay, so being kind of vaguely, he doesn't say it outright, but vaguely, he says leaves the impression there are about 6 machine guns firing on the Australians as they land. This is where, entering into the story, is information from the Turkish Archives. Recent research in the Turkish Archives indicates it was only at 7:40 a.m. So remember they landed at 4:30 a.m. It was only at 7:40 a.m. the Turkish 27th Machine Gun Company with 4 machine guns arrived to be positioned on the 3rd Ridge inland from the coast. But the newspaper reports and the official history talks about the Turks with machine guns and firing upon the Australians as they were landing. It would seem as though, according to Chris Roberts anyway, that there were certainly machine guns being fired. They were being fired from the steam pinnaces by the British Navy against shots that they could see being fired from the land. So they could hear machine guns, but remember these are raw and inexperienced troops, and they believed that they were being fired upon by the Turks. Okay, well, we've got more to come now. Look at this. Roberts. According to Roberts, and making use of the archives, the Turkish archives, and other people have done it too, he's not the only. When they landed, they had the Anzacs had an overwhelming superiority of 50 to 1 at the point of landing. 50 to 1, which is pretty startling. And this is a summary of what Chris Roberts says, and kind of like this has been well received, and it's considered to be kind of, in a way, the state of the art. That at 4:30 a.m. in pitch darkness, the 1,500-strong Anzac covering force began landing. Until Turkish reinforcements began arriving around 10 a.m, there were no more than 140 Turkish defenders in the general vicinity who were overwhelmingly outnumbered and attacked at their weakest point, the intersection between the Turks' 2 defending platoons. I'll just modify that a little bit. Where they landed, most of them, there were 2 platoons. There was another platoon a little further to the north at Fisherman's Hut, a place called Fisherman's Hut, and there was a different outcome there. But where they mainly landed, only 140 Turkish defenders, according to Roberts, and no machine guns. Turkish artillery fire was only sporadic, not concentrated and effective until about 11 a.m. The Anzac first wave, this is extraordinary, suffered minimal casualties. The quote is from Roberts, and then not everyone likes him, but Peter Stanley says perhaps 10 or at most 20 were killed at that when they first hit the beaches, and then that first kind of like half hour or so. 5 a.m, most of the first wave were occupying the plateau above the cove. The Turks had run away. 6 a.m, over 4,000 Anzacs had landed. By 8 a.m, 8,000 were ashore, with a handful of small parties having moved over the first ridge and beyond. Some of them, they're real heroes of the Australians, are those who do what they were told to do. They race ahead and go further, but they aren't backed up. And then they're surrounded and they're wiped out. They're the real heroes of the piece. Some Turkish defenders had been overrun, captured or killed. Others were ordered to withdraw. They were in full retreat. So what did the Anzacs do? There's nobody in front of them. Oh, I see. These are some pictures from the day. I'm just interested in look at all the Sarchats. Okay. We're still in the morning. This Roberts account. Around 6 a.m, the Anzacs advanced covering force was ordered by its commander, Colonel Ewan Sinclair Claggett. He's the one who was having these nightmares of being attacked on his right flank. They were ordered, the covering force, to halt and dig in along Second Ridge. So some of them had raced ahead in parties of, I don't know, 20, 30 or so. There might have been 100 or so that had really raced ahead. But the rest of them were told, stop. And these poor other ones are way out there on their own, and no one comes and is backing them up. By about 7:30 a.m, Sabine is still on board his ship, and so is certainly the other correspondent. By about 7:30 a.m, movement inland had effectively ceased. There were no Turks in front of them. And the Anzacs had stopped advancing, apart from those poor idiots who'd raced way ahead. And by mid-morning, a static Anzac front line existed, just 900 metres inland from the beach. They had to go 5 kilometres, and they stopped 900 metres. 10 a.m, arriving Turkish troops, only then are the reserves coming up, had seized the 3rd Ridge in force. 2 p.m, about 12,000 Anzacs were ashore, facing some 5,000 Turks. From 11:30 a.m, the Turks had been counter-attacking. 2:30 p.m, that's when the fighting, the rugged fighting, the serious fighting was going on. A full-scale infantry battle was being fought until 6 p.m, and there were heavy casualties. Not in the morning when the landings took place, except near Fisherman's Hut. But the casualties only occurring late. By 8 p.m, it was clear to senior Anzac officers their landing had been contained by the Turks, the consensus being evacuation was needed to avoid being overrun the next day. It wasn't accepted by High Command, and they were told to dig in. They were not to evacuate. Okay, so the next 9 months. Within a week, the situation at Anzac would degenerate into static trench warfare. Both sides were intent on strengthening their defences, and trenches were constructed within close proximity to each other. The 239 days they were there, across 239 days there would be minimal change, with the Anzacs attacking the Turks on just 5 of those days. Firepower was all important. Combined infantry and artillery firepower on either side could defeat any major attacks, but it was insufficient to dominate and defeat their opponents. The Anzacs had insufficient artillery to do so, and the Turks insufficient shells. So they're eventually, well, this is what it's like, trench warfare. I want to go back now, and I don't want to leave you with the impression that the AIF was hopeless, so hopefully I'll resurrect my reputation with you with this thing at the end. According to this military historian, Geoffrey Gray, the AIF's 1st Division, and I would suggest we'll extend it to all those who went overseas to begin with, to Egypt, was probably the worst trained formation. So I was not saying anything about the character of the men or anything, but they're the worst trained ever sent from Australia's shores. They were the worst trained because they weren't regular troops. And they had this, as I said beforehand, that the military, the law was that they had to go and do kind of training on a Thursday evening after work, and then they'd have to go to a Easter camp of about 14 days. That was how well trained, and even their officers, up to Lieutenant Colonel level, that's as well trained as they were. They were just kind of running around in the bush and having fun. And it got no better when they were in Egypt. Now remember, they were there for about 4 months. Brutal and White portraits there. Chief of Staff of the Anzac Commander Birdwood later told Boone the training undertaken in Egypt for open warfare and manoeuvring around the desert, etc., and infantry rushes in the desert, was based upon obsolete tactical theory. I take that to mean it was based upon the lessons that they learnt from fighting in the Boer War and wars of manoeuvre, but not to do with trench warfare. And this is the killer. And it was aimed chiefly at wearing out the men so that they would be less of a nuisance in Cairo in the evenings. So that's the type of training they've got. So they came away from Australia with pretty poor training, and it really didn't improve greatly. Okay, so this is kind of doesn't sound very fashionable, but this book was written in 1918, and thank God for the British. Well, we've got to run down the British, haven't we? But it gives you a different perspective, this whole thing, Amy Fox. Despite her analysis, despite their blooding at Gallipoli, the inexperience of the Australians required them to learn the basics of soldiering from scratch. So what they'd been trained with was pretty useless. They'd learn on the job somewhat, but so they are pulled out from Gallipoli back to Egypt, and they're kicking up their heels and relaxing and gradually being brought into training. Then they're taken to France. Evacuated to Egypt, the AIF used British training infrastructure and training methods. In France, considerable use was to be made of British training skills. I should explain this. That the theory amongst British military historians is that British learned on the job. Now, the first big battle they had was really the Battle of the Somme, and did disastrously in that. It went for 140 days, and they learned a lot from what happened during that battle, during that 140 days. There's a lot to be learned from it, but it took them a long time to do it. And it took them until working out the way of fighting, until into 1918 to perfect their ideas. And the beneficiaries are going to be, one of the groups will be the Australians. So we'll go back to what I was reading. We have also got a lot of AIF officers at this time were British. The AIF was integrated into the imperial military system, but they got all this kind of know-how. Now, they were supported by British artillery and logistics and you name it. Whilst retaining its own unique identity, that's kind of fairly important. And they were kept together, the Anzac Cove. They weren't farmed out here, there and everywhere. They were kept together. And if you got wounded and you went off to England, then you came back, you went straight back into the same unit as you had before. So you've got this esprit de corps, but it was got nothing to do with the bush, but it was due to this friendship that was built up while you were in the AIF. Whilst retaining their own unique identity, it was transformed into a high-performing instrument within the British military machine. By the war's end, now this is what she says, the AIF had become the corps d'elite of the British Army. They were the best of the best. They're as good as anybody else, but she's saying that, and I'll just suggest this. Okay, an example of this was on the 8th of August, they were being used as shock troops in the Battle of Amiens. Fantastic photograph there. But during that war, according to military historians, they weren't the best. The Canadians were probably better than them, and although they're pretty good, the New Zealanders are considered also highly. It was here, the Battle of Mont St. Quentin Peron on the 1st of September 1918, from late August to about the 3rd of September, that the Australian troops really hit their straps. And it wasn't because of their bush background, it was because they had been trained by British trainers in the latest way of fighting. You can see there, they've got machine guns, they're waiting for an artillery barrage to lift, which would have been supplied by the British. And given this type of support, this logistics support, even a grossly undermanned platoon, not having 41, but that's how many were left out of a 41-man platoon, they were extremely effective. And these are the ones who, better than anybody else, put into effect the new battle techniques, platoon infantry techniques that the British had developed. And there's my very long-winded response. I'll quickly read through it. How the first IAF performed in the climactic phase of the fighting on the Western Front in August-September 1918, particularly the Battle of Mont Saint-Quentin provided evidence for exactly what the Australian people had been longing to hear for many a year. That when in uniform, the young men were the best of the best. Well, that British military historian said so. Having been expertly trained in state-of-the-art tactics and under the command of John Monash in 1918, they performed spectacularly well, according to everybody on the battlefield. But such, now we're going back to what the talk had been mainly about, but such had not been the case when they first went into battle on the 25th of April 1915. Then their training had been no better than basic, and their battlefield command was extremely risk-averse. I'm talking about their commander who dug in and Anzac is not going ahead. The Gallipoli aim failed to achieve its strategic objective, a fact disguised by heroic newspaper reports by Ellis, Ashmead-Bartlett and Charles Bean, which had a limited basis in reality. Yet it was these reports that laid the groundwork for the original Anzac legend, that the character of Australian troops and their skills and ultimately their successes were determined by their bush background. In broad terms, Bean had already advanced this very proposition 7 years before the war, and he proceeded to elaborate it in the Australian official history of the war. That's it. So.
We do have time for questions. Anyone would like to direct questions to David? Some raising hand.
Yes. I didn't agree with your analysis of the learning curve. So.
No, I'm just going to talk about untrained colonial divisions.
Yep.
Land at Anzac Cove at night. The British regular division couldn't land to daylight. In August offensive, the new army divisions were over land at night. It seemed to be the British were even more cautious and wouldn't land at night.
No one was going to do any good at Gallipoli because of an amphibious force landing. It was just an impossible task that they were. So look, wouldn't disagree with you. I wouldn't disagree with you. Yes.
So at the Ashmead-Bartlett, you said he was on the Queen Elizabeth off Cape Cross?
No. The British official historian was down the south of Cape Helles. Ashmead-Bartlett was on a British warship and he was anchored off Gallipoli, but he didn't come ashore until that night.
Okay, so the official historian would have been the one who saw the daylight landings down in...
Yes, but the point I'd make about that was he's with the British Commander-in-Chief. They're getting all the intelligence from all across the whole battlefront. And he would have been getting probably a better idea from that than these two historians, these war correspondents were. They were on the spot, but they weren't getting any intelligence reports. That's what I'd suggest. Yes?
Are you, just to take your hypothesis further, because you could see how Bean was trusted, because he was the only one there. He was there on the ground.
Trusted by Australians, but the one that the Australians really trusted was Ashmi-Bartlett, an Englishman saying this about...
So you're saying he probably, whilst he might have was there, he actually wasn't talking to the troops, because we all believe...
Well, no, the answer was he was. He had to land, but a lot of it is made up, and from what they saw in the dark and all that. And who did he speak to?
Yeah.
He spoke to the officers. He only ever spoke to the officers. Hardly ever spoke. Well, we can't be certain exactly who he spoke to, but that's where they got their information from anyway. And what I'm suggesting is they didn't have a clue, hardly had a clue what was going on at all. But when they were told later on how brave and heroic they were, and Superman, they thought that was fantastic. Yes?
I have two questions. The first one, is there any corroboration from the New Zealand side of things? Because they...
I was just going through what the Australians have written. Isn't this marvellous? The Anzac thing, Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, and it's got they don't even mention the New Zealanders. And they think, oh, they're a little bit too straight-laced and too much by the rules of war, and we know what to do, and if we need to kind of bayonet a prisoner or something, that's what the Turks. the New Zealand, they take prisoners. I think that was the kind of general attitude towards New Zealanders, but they're left out of this story. It's ridiculous. Yeah.
Yeah, because I just mentioned that because I thought they were pretty brave in service.
I don't doubt it.
Yeah. Now the second question is, I noticed there was a photo there of Charles Bean and Prime Minister Hughes.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, was Hughes the guy who sort of went against? He wanted conscription.
He wanted conscription.
And I'm just thinking, it was well known before the war. Sorry, not well known, but there was a sense that Europe was bound for war. And it crystallised pretty quickly with the assassination. So I'm just wondering, I think what I'm trying to say is that perhaps there was an ulterior motive in Bean's whole trip to Australia and just sort of garnering support for the empire, etc., etc.
I don't think so. He just wanted to get a...
Sorry, what?
He just was taking advantage of his father's connections in Sydney and thought he might be able to have a legal career here. I don't think there's anything more to it than that.
Okay.
Yes.
So you're saying that the legend was wrong?
Well, that's what they. Yeah.
But if it was wrong in the basis of the Anzac landing, the corresponding involvement with Australia within the war,
yeah,
would the legend then still occur with Bean's involvement in writing the total history of the Australians in the First World War?
Well,
we're on a force to celebrate it the way we may do.
Look, that's what bravely and frequently, and they were shock troops in the end, and the British used them in those types of positions.
I'm fully aware, but I'm asking you, do you think that legend would not have existed had the truth been based only at that time on what is now considered to be a
well, it's a very, very, very different story, but I'm sure that something would have been written up as heroic, etc. about them.
Because it's also to do with aspects of, okay, we became a nation.
Yeah.
All that, further, not the war.
Yep. And the Australians wanted to hear that.
And yes, but is it a falsehood to suggest that we live in a false world? Is it really?
Well, look, all I'd simply say is it's a very powerful legend, and people want to believe it.
Yeah.
Now, the history kind of doesn't support the military history doesn't support the legend, but it doesn't matter. You've got something which is real, which is the Anzac legend, and it has a lot of power over people.
It doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
But precisely because it is what it is in today's sense.
So I'm trying to do two things at the one time, but I think it exists regardless of whatever the military history of the period was.
Yeah.
And I tried to bring that out. I tried to prove it by saying, look how enlistment shot up. Yes.
David, if I may refer to you as David. I just noted down here. I appreciate all of what you've said. Question, is there anything in the Turkish archives, archival material, to corroborate or otherwise, the accounts of the journalists or the accounts of...
No, when they've gone into the Turkish archives, it presents it's a totally different picture that's coming out.
Can you elaborate just a little?
Well, prior to the Turkish archives, the Australians were landing against a very strongly reinforced defence.
Mm-hmm.
When they look at the Turkish archives, there's hardly any Turks there at all. And it's worse than that. The reserves are being held way back inland. Prior to the Turkish archives being used, it was believed that the Anzacs were fired upon by all these machine guns. 6 machine guns, according to Bean. When they opened up the Turkish archives, there were no machine guns there at all. There's hardly any artillery there at all. So the answer to your question is, the opening up of the archives, it's not that they were closed, but they were being used. Or remember, the winners write history, and the losers, well, they can look after themselves. But after 100 years, some people decided to look at the Turkish archives.
Just to finish off, if I may, just on that one. Had the privilege in 2011 of travelling to Gallipoli Peninsula. I had a grandpa who was in the 14th Battalion reinforcements there. There was a Turkish guide, a young